Engineers versus Lawyers. Today I'm looking at Dan Wong's Breakneck, a book about the lawyerly society versus the engineering state. So, hello, welcome to the channel. My name is Zach. This channel is, again, mostly science fiction and fantasy book reviews, but my interests do expand outside of that at times with business books, personal development, comics, manga, so a little of everything. But yes, today we are delving into Dan Wong's Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. So I picked this up as a just general interest in China. So, for some personal anecdotes, yes, my wife is Chinese. She is a professor of international business and studies China and other international companies. So, we do have lively discussions about China. I've been, of course, interested in China for years upon years. And yes, I read most articles that I see on like the New York Times or wherever on the internet talking about China's rise, which we all can't really ignore living in the United States. So I believe I read about Dan Wong's latest book, Breakneck, in a, yes, New York Times article. I was going through my internet history and couldn't really see where I got recommended this, but it must have been a New York Times article of either upcoming books or a discussion on China, which I generally read to check out to see what's going on in China. And this book has a very interesting premise. I found it super fascinating that the main argument is kind of which is the better path for a country. Is an engineering state like China, or is it a lawyerly society like the US has become? So, this is kind of a book in the series that I'm reading lately on China. There's been a couple great ones this year. I believe I've talked about most of them on the channel. So, the ones that I've read personally are Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company by Patrick McGee, which was an interesting look at China through supply chain and specifically analysis of Apple moving their operations to China and how kind of China captured that market and built up the whole infrastructure around phones and technology because of Apple. The other one I also read was The Thinking Machine, which is Jensen Huang, NVIDIA, and the world's most coveted microchip. So maybe a little bit similar in kind of the tech industry, not necessarily China focused, but there were a lot of stories and anecdotes about China and discussion on sourcing parts. So more of a similar parallel to Apple and China because it also talks about developing technology and supply chain side. And then lastly, the one that kind of got recommended on this from a maybe global perspective in this basket of books on China and technology and the future is If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. Why Superhuman AI Would Kill Us All by Eliza Yudkowsky and Nate Soares. So this is more about just general geopolitics and AI, which of course China has a huge interest in. Every major country has interest in developing the greatest large language model. So that was also an interesting kind of future one. And maybe the last one I'll put out was Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari, which is also about AI and the future of kind of countries and how this arms race between countries and how AI and large language models technology could decide that and the other new war front. But anyways, back to this book, Breakneck by Dan Wong. This book, Dan Wong is a Canadian, I believe, and he'd spent time in China. So this book is kind of on the ground reporting from China, looking at it as an outsider, as a foreigner, but also comparing China to the United States, obviously the two kind of largest world powers at the moment in 2025, and parallels how they got to where they are in analyzing how each side kind of runs at a policy level. So this is more of maybe a policy and ideology book and examining the rise of both countries in parallel, as well as kind of giving advice for how each country could improve and learn from each other, I guess you could say, in a way. So he does go through kind of a history of China through this lens of the rise of China and the power rise as China became a world power and how it was designed as an engineering state. So the people running China, so the people at the top of the political parties had engineering degrees and they kind of viewed policy, they viewed society from the engineering lens of kind of twisting levers, whether that's population control, like the one child policy, which is a really fascinating chapter about the one child policy and how it was designed with that almost engineering mindset of controlling a variable in a population and then seeing what that becomes as an outcome. So it speaks to myself, who has engineering STEM training in computer science and playing with variables, but doing this at a population level and not necessarily thinking about it as the impact on the individual person in the society, which is the other half of the argument of how where we are now as the United States has become a more lawyerly society, where, yes, we examine everything for how it affects the individual. When anytime a large project, like a public works project, tries to get done in the United States, there has to be environmental study and impact study, and they could get derailed because they're harming an endangered species of fish in a creek that's only tangentially related. So Dan Wong kind of examines this from both those narratives of how this engineering society, this engineering state has allowed China to build at breakneck speed, hence the title of the book, and get to where it got in such a short time, doing great feats that we all read about here in the West, things like building the entire interstate system of highways, laying down millions, I don't know, millions, but lots of kilometers and miles of high speed rail that we don't have anything like that in the US. How, for example, during COVID, yes, they were able to build a COVID hospital in a weekend. These engineering feats that by us seem amazing. And it's, of course, part the push and incentive by the centralized planning that China has, the central government, versus United States more kind of distributed responsibilities because the power is pushed to the state, to the individual level, where that is most close to the people affected by these policies or these initiatives, and where China can just dictate policy from a top down perspective and get these major projects done at breakneck speed and allowed them to accelerate their emergence as a world superpower. Then, of course, the flip side, Dan Wong also examines the history of the US and how the US used to build at a breakneck speed, looking at United States history at like the post World War II boom, where the internet highway system, as an example, was built. Major projects like dams and hydropower and these large public works projects were a priority for the United States, but we've evolved over time to be a more lawyerly society. And his contrast, which is apparently true, and it's kind of very interesting to think about, that yes, most leaders in the US have law degrees, contrasting with China, which most leadership at the highest levels of government have engineering degrees, and how that shifting mindset of thinking like a lawyer versus thinking like an engineer, and how that kind of plays a part in to guiding policy and the growth of a country. And the conclusion of the book and is sort of a little from both, right? It's he doesn't make a strong decision either or a strong recommendation either way, but kind of leaves it up to the reader, myself, or who, if you choose to read this, of where each country can learn from each other. So, for using the China example, which he paints in a big, maybe stronger picture because it's more of the success story from a maybe a growth perspective, is that this unbridled growth, of course, you may have seen stories of like the ghost towns is an interesting example where the government decided we need to build housing. So they build these housing overnight and then no one actually lives there. They're shoddy construction because they're built so fast. So there are some maybe long-term negatives to having like a lax building policy. If you've seen Chinesium or any of these made in China, like the jokes of made in China, when that's applied, without regulation, what are the long-term effects on the people using these products, living in these buildings with kind of shoddy craftsmanship, things like that. Um, are going to have consequences. And then the flip side, so maybe in that case, more regulation might be needed, building standards that ensure safety. And then the flip side, of course, is the US and how everything gets lawyered. So policy is designed with lawyering in mind. So that's all taken into account. There has to be a million studies, and maybe the US needs to remove some of that red tape. So maybe that parallels also what we're seeing right now in 2025 into 2026 with the current administration sort of forcing through some projects, getting things done that weren't maybe previously done before because of all the red tape. So is that a good thing that we're forcing some of these through? Again, there's always pros and cons that yes, we're finally getting certain things done, but is it the right thing? Should we have examined it more? But what's the trade-off between speed and safety is kind of the central issue that Dan Wong plays with and shows that both sides could learn from each other, I guess done correctly, of course with foresight of knowing the results, but investing more in infrastructure is kind of his main recommendation for the United States. Not necessarily, I mean, I know I use a government example, not necessarily some public policy issues and programs that the government may be pushing through, but building infrastructure and investing in infrastructure is more of what Wong is recommending that the United States needs to get back to reinvesting in infrastructure and public works. Right? I think most of us can agree things like just roads, repairing roads, building new bridges, investing in public works is a priority that should get prioritized for the United States. And then conversely, for China, some of these large public works projects should maybe be done with a little more care and concern for the people that are the users of these public facilities, building standards, and anything that touches a general person should maybe get a little more safety and impact lawyering, but regulation. That was my just thoughts. I thought it was very interesting overall. I learned a bit of history from both sides, some history of what went behind some of the policy decisions when Wong goes into some of the stories and backstories of what drove some of the policies that we know about China, as well as a little bit of the history of the United States, where it looks at from a policy building infrastructure investment perspective. And again, the factors that went into that and kind of how that's shaping where we are now from both sides. So I thought it was a very good read. It was rather short, very engaging. So if you're interested in politics, world building, like a sci-fi fantasy, or you're just in general business, like I also have a strong interest in business, I think it's a great intro to learn about China, learn about Chinese relations with the U.S. and how they look at building things in public works. It kind of gives you a really strong insight into the mentality of the engineer state and how they got to where they are now. So that is my thoughts and a semi-guest review of Dan Wong's Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Highly recommend it. Thought it was a great read and think you should check it out. So thanks for watching and have a great day.